Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm a former Boeing 737 pilot and a member of PMDG's tech team. Welcome to this tutorial on the performance tool in PMDG's Universal Flight Tablet. Now, before we start up with the performance tool, a quick where and when. So obviously we are first going to request our flight plan from SimBrief, and during the pre-flight procedure we would use that one to determine the restricted takeoff weight. Now, that is a calculation which can also be done in the performance tool, but since I know that the vast majority of flight simmers is just never gonna do this, I am going to skip over it. The short version of it is just don't enter any weight for the takeoff, and then it's going to calculate the maximum takeoff weight that you can use to depart from the runway on the given conditions. Now let's go ahead with what most of you are going to use, and that is the takeoff calculation by the time that we are about to make our final calculations and start our pushback. So we basically start with this once our final weights are given and once the load sheet has arrived. Now, in terms of load sheet, you can simply use the payload menu over here to get your takeoff weight or your gross weight, or you can use an external tool like Virtual Performance Tool or TopCat that all generate load sheets. Do note that in some OFP formats, SimBrief also generates a load sheet for you. In any case, make sure that the number you enter from the load sheet is what you've got actually on board your airplane. An easy way to do that in the PMDG is go to the performance page and then just click the LSK next to the zero fuel weight, and that is going to import your zero fuel weight directly from what is currently on board the aircraft. And by using that, you can then grab the gross weight of your plane as applicable. Now, going back to the calculation, once the load sheet has arrived, once that check is done, and once the gross weight over here is confirmed, we're going to go into the takeoff calculations. We will start by importing our departure runway, and we can use that for the import from operational flight plan function, which is going to insert the airport ICAO and the airport name. However, you can also enter that manually by clicking into the field and then getting to the keyboard where you can enter it yourself. Next up, we're going to select the runway, and do note that this is not automatically uplinked, but rather the pilot has to choose it manually, just like in the real tool. So once our runway is chosen, all the runway data is going to automatically be entered, but be aware of the runway condition which you might have to change for yourself. Do note that just because it is not raining at the moment, it must not necessarily mean that the runway is actually dry. For example, if we are looking outside the window over here, we can see that we've got some rather moist conditions, so by the time you calculate your takeoff data, do take a moment to think about if the runway might become wet in case it isn't yet. Also be aware that if a shower has recently passed, then calculating wet figures is usually the better option, because you can surely see how your runway state is directly around the aircraft, but you don't necessarily know what it looks like 4 kilometers further down. Alright, so we've got a couple more options over here, like standing water, slush, compact snow, dry snow, wet ice. Those are there in the real plane and are used on a regular basis. However, in Flight Simulator we have no way of finding out about any of these, so the two conditions that matter for your simulator performance are basically dry and wet. Alright, when that has been decided, we can continue with the aircraft data. Now, aircraft data we can either import from the operational flight plan, but do note that that is normally not the same as the data that you actually have inside your airplane. Therefore, I would recommend to use the import from aircraft function. However, when using that, be careful that in case you are still running a live boarding through the PMDG ground services, then take a quick look over here that your passengers have actually all boarded and that your cargo is completely loaded. Only if that is the case, use the import from aircraft button, since it is going to import the weight that you have currently in your airplane. A couple more fields that we need to have a look at nonetheless. The import from aircraft button is only going to import the weight and the CG, so we need to have a look at flaps, rating, anti-ice and packs. Now, a few things for us to discuss over here. If we have a look at the takeoff flaps, then optimum is the default selection. Optimum in the 737 is normally going to default to a flaps 5 takeoff, which is the best compromise between performance and efficiency, aka drag caused by the flaps, and safety margin for your takeoff in terms of tail clearance. Now, a couple numbers for you to be aware of. With a flap 5 takeoff, you normally have approximately 50 centimeters of tail clearance when you rotate and when the airplane lifts off. With a flaps 1 takeoff, which is more economical in terms of fuel usage as you have less drag, but with a flaps 1 takeoff, that tail clearance decreases to 30 centimeters. Therefore, your safety margin is greatly reduced and is almost double if you go for a flap 5 takeoff. If you simply leave it on optimum, it is going to choose flaps 5 on the majority of 737 models. However, be aware that the optimum function is tailored to the particular airplane type that you're sitting into. For example, a 737-600 might generate different results than a 737-8 or 900. Next up, we've got the rating field, where we can choose optimum, takeoff, takeoff 1, takeoff 2. Now, note that these are named takeoff 1, takeoff 2, and not by the engine rating, which is a little discrepancy at the moment between the Universal Flight Tablet and the FMC. But it somewhat makes sense, and these discrepancies do even exist in the real OPT, depending on what the airline has chosen as an input. For example, if an airline operates both 737NG and 737 MAX, then the NG might show you your takeoff rating down here in 26K, 24K, 22K, and so on, while the MAX is going to show you takeoff, takeoff 1, takeoff 2. So an easy way to remember, 26K, or the highest standard rating, is takeoff. The first D rate is takeoff 1, the second is takeoff 2, basically as it is written down there as well. Okay. Talking about the rating, I could see that a lot of flight simmers have complained that it always goes for TO and not for TO1 or TO2. Well, that comes down to the logic that is behind this. So there are several different logics in the Boeing OPT, and the airline can basically choose from what it wants. So if you leave the rating at optimum, it might either try to give you the highest assumed temperature, it might either try to give you the highest fixed D rate or the lowest fixed D rate. Now, why is there a difference between the two, and why does all of that even matter? Well, it's quite easy. If you go for a takeoff 2 rating, then your engines are limited to that particular setting. In case of this particular airplane, if we go for 22K, then we must not advance the thrust levers greater than 21.6% N1, even in case of an engine failure, unless ground contact is imminent. The reason for it is using a fixed D rate is going to have an impact on your VMCG calculation, which is the minimum control speed on the ground, and on your VMCA calculation, which is minimum control speed in the air. Now, the difference is quite simple. Using fixed D rates, your engine thrust in case of engine failure must not be advanced above this limit unless ground contact is imminent. If you're using assumed temperature, then it is going to take the fixed D rate that's been calculated by default, for example 26K, giving us 98% N1 in this situation, but the reduction you get through the temperature, let's say for example we choose 60 degrees over here, this reduction can be cancelled out by pushing your thrust levers further forward. Now in the 737, this is a little bit of an interesting thing, which unfortunately is not modeled by PMDG. So let me show you what I mean. If I'm removing the assumed temperature over here, you can see that the green indicators that show you the current maximum thrust will show you your 26% or your 26K. Now if I'm entering an assumed temperature, for example 60 degrees, in the real world those bugs would stay where they are. They should not move down. However, the indication on the top should move to the new takeoff N1 setting. This is also the reason why on the takeoff page itself you see your target N1, because in the real world when you're taking off and when the takeoff thrust is set, it will not necessarily be at the green box. Indeed, whenever an assumed temperature is used, your takeoff thrust will not be at the green indicator, but the green indicator is going to show you the fixed D rate you have chosen. Unfortunately, this is currently not modeled in the PMDG 737, but I thought I would give you that kind of information in this video anyway, because it might be added with a future update. Now, Going back to the logic behind this, basically when a takeoff 2 has been chosen, your takeoff speeds can be lower because the maximum thrust to be achieved is less than if you choose a higher rating. Or to put it into other words, in case it was too difficult to understand, when you choose full takeoff thrust, then you can advance your engines all the way to the full takeoff thrust limit, which in case of our current configuration is 98%. So you can advance your engine thrust all the way here. However, higher thrust means that in case of an engine failure, the force dragging you sideways by only a single engine working is going to be greater than if you've got, for example, the 22k D-rate, which is going to limit your engine thrust over here. The greater force means your control surfaces on the airplane need to be able to produce a greater force as well, and thereby it is going to limit the takeoff speeds to higher air speeds, because higher airspeed mean more airflow, therefore higher efficiency of your controls. Alright, now PMDG have put the following logic into the optimum rating. And note that this is airline customizable, so just because one tool shows you this, it doesn't mean the other is going to show you that as well, but it is airline customizable. For PMDG, they go with the highest safety margin, which in case of optimum means it is going to try to get a TO rating rather than a lower rating like TO1 or TO2. The logic behind that being, it can still limit you with the selected temperature, and thereby your actual engine temperature on the takeoff is basically the same if you went for a 22k D rate, for example, with a lower assumed temperature. But in case of an engine failure, you have additional thrust available, and therefore you can achieve a better climb performance. Now, a lot of airlines actually go for the TO2 rating because it means your takeoff speeds are going to be lower, and thereby you are going to achieve less wear and tear on the tires because you can lift off at an earlier point. However, in the PMDG, optimum means that it is going to strive for a TO takeoff and then use the highest possible assumed temperature in order to limit your engine thrust. Right, next up we've got anti-ice. Now anti-ice is a rather easy thing to think about, but there is a little bit more into it. So, starting with anti-ice, when do you need it? Basically when the temperature is 10 degrees centigrade or less and visible moisture is present. Note that visible moisture can also mean that you might have, for example, fog with a visibility of less than 1 statute miles or 1,600 meters. Now, in our case, if we look forward, we can see that there is a little bit of fog or probably rain over there, a little bit down the runway. So just because it is dry where we are right now, again, that doesn't mean that anti-ice is not necessarily needed. However, looking at the temperature is 14 degrees, so it's warm enough that we don't need it now. However, that is what I meant earlier in the video, like down the runway, the surface is wet, over here it's dry, so still think about it and go, for example, for your wet condition for your calculations now. Alright, now anti-ice offers you two options, engines and engines plus wings. You go for the engine option if you don't estimate to use wing anti-ice after takeoff. However, on the ground, you would still turn all three on, with the exception that you don't turn the wing anti-ice on if the airplane has been de-iced. In that case, don't use wing anti-ice because the heat of the leading edges of the wing is going to weaken the de-icing fluid and therefore invalidate your holdover timetables. However, nonetheless, by normal procedures, if the airplane has not been de-iced, you turn both engine anti-ice and wing anti-ice on. Now, when you set takeoff thrust, wing anti-ice is going to trip off. If you don't expect to put it on again after takeoff, so looking outside, if we had a temperature, for example, of 8 degrees right now, if we look outside, then we can already make out the tops over there, and I would not expect to find icing in these clouds with a ground temperature of 8 degrees. Therefore, I would take the engines only option. Only if wing anti-ice is expected to be used, you choose engines plus wing. In our case today though, we are going to go for anti-ice off. Next up we got the packs on or off. That is, well, quite self-explanatory. If you cannot take off in a certain condition, going for a PAX off takeoff is going to produce more thrust, and therefore you might increase your performance restricted takeoff weight with that. Alright, so default selection though should be PAX on. In the 737, a PAX off takeoff is not performed as regularly as in an A320. Indeed, I only had to do, I believe, 2 of them in 5 years of flying the plane. So, you get it. Alright, next up we can go for the weather. Now, importing the weather is obviously the easiest option we've got available. And you can see temperature 13, wind variable 2, and the QNH 1001. Now, if you prefer not to import it and to put it in manually, then you can either type variable/2 for the wind, when it is indeed variable, or you can just go for a -2, and then it is going to assume a direct tailwind. Note that whenever we've got variable winds, we are going to assume they are direct tailwinds, and the tablet is going to do the same when the variable/2 option is entered over here. Now, there is one special case, and that is in case you've got META that shows you something like this. Let's say we had a wind 210 degrees, and that comes at, for example, 10 knots. But let's say it was variable between 190 and 340. So something like this in your META. What you're going to do in that case is you always take the most conservative wind. That means either the least headwind component or the greatest tailwind component, depending on whichever is more severe or whichever comes out at the greatest tailwind. So in case of this, we're standing on a runway 24 today, so we've got the wind deflected like 50 degrees to the left from that variable 190, but if you look at this one, 340, then you will see that that is 100 degrees deflected to the right. So the most conservative wind in this case would be 340 at 10, and that would be the value you would enter in the wind field down here. Note that the import weather function is not necessarily going to do that automatically. It is always worth going over to the weather radar, or to the weather reader, I should say, and check the latest META to see what kind of indication you receive down here. Also have a look at the tempo wind to see if there might be something worse in the tempo field down there. Alright, with all of the data entered right now, we can hit the calculate button, and then we're going to get our takeoff calculation. Once that is done, we are going to go over into the FMC and we are going to enter that. So for the rating, we've got TO, which in our case is full 26K. And then we've got an assumed temperature of 48 degrees. So let's go ahead and enter that down here. And here we go, 48 degrees, here we go. And that gives us 87.1% N1. And we compare that to the value that we get in the calculator over here. Now, funnily enough, we are getting a difference over here, which we should certainly not get. So let's quickly check. We've got 48. Oh, here's the difference. Okay, so again, carefully make sure that you do the correct numbers. So we've got TO 26K, 48 degrees, 92.4%. And if we compare that, we get 92.3 in here, and that is an acceptable difference. If the difference is greater than 0.2% N1, then I would question the calculation and once again verify that the correct data has been entered in terms of the rating and the assumed temperature. There is, however, one exception to this rule. In the Boeing 737, your takeoff N1 that you've got shown over here is calculated depending on the status of the bleed air system. Now, if you do a bleed off takeoff, then obviously you're going to have more performance available than you do bleed on takeoff. So if we quickly calculate and configure for that, then we end up somewhat like this, with takeoff where the APU is going to feed the pack. And if we have a look at that, you can see we are now getting reduced numbers down here. In the 737 it's quite easy. So let me restore the original configuration. In the 737 you will have a difference of 0.8% N1 if the bleed system is not pressurized at the moment you're entering this. So let's say you're in the pre-flight procedure and your engine bleeds are not available, so let's just turn them off for the sake of the calculation, because your APU has not been started. So you don't have a bleed source available, and the duct pressure is 0. When the duct pressure is 0, you are going to lose those 0.8%. In other words, when you calculate a PAX on takeoff in here, but your actual PAX are still off in the airplane because you don't have a bleed air source yet, then you are going to see a different N1 value for your takeoff. So that's something to keep in mind when you do these entries during the pre-flight procedure. Alright, so the difference, by the way, is 0.8 in case TO is chosen, and in case you've got another rating, like for example TO2, then the difference would just be 0.7. But we're just going to leave it at that for now. Alright, that is the first part that you need to do on the ground. That is the takeoff performance calculation. What you also need to do prior to your takeoff is to run the landing dispatch calculation. Now, landing dispatch is actually quite an easy thing for you to do. Basically, you just import your data from the OFP or you enter it manually. In our case, we're flying towards Southend Airport today, which has a really short runway of just about 1,800 meters. So let's say we're landing runway 23 in Southend, and we are just going to keep those default values and then hit import weather. Now let's run those calculations and see what we get. So we've got a couple different indications here, and we've also got a choice to make on here, on the data. So first off, let's just start with the default calculation that we've got in here. By default, it is going to predict a landing flap 30, PAX on, anti-ice off, as that is the most common configuration you might have. However, in order to determine the maximum landing weight you can take, it may be an idea to go flaps 40 and calculate that. However, just be sure that you're actually going to calculate something that is at least realistic, if not more conservative. So a higher flap setting obviously might make a difference, but for example, if you were limited by the missed approach climb gradient, a lower flap setting of flap 30 might be an advantage. So like that, you just have to make the difference and do your calculations yourself. Again, the same rule applies in terms of the winds as it did for takeoff, and keep in mind to remember the anti-ice depending on the weather conditions on your arrival airport. The reason we do this calculation, the landing dispatch calculation here on the ground, is that before takeoff we need to make sure that we are actually able to land our airplane under the given conditions at our destination. Now, you can see right now landing weight, which is maximum landing weight, 66,361 kilograms, is the limiting weight for our given runway. Now, here's something to take into account. If we have a look at our plane right now, we are at a weight of 72.9 tons. Now, we are going to burn a little bit of fuel, but it's just a 40 minutes flight, so let's say we burn 2 tons of fuel. That means we would arrive at 71 tons of landing weight, which is above the maximum landing weight calculated in here on the landing dispatch. This means we cannot take off. So we have to do something about our landing weight, which means offloading either passengers or cargo or both. Or in case you took some tankering fuel, you can, for example, offload that as well. But for that reason, we must run the landing dispatch calculation, and we must run them early in the process so that, for example, we can base our fuel decision on it. If we had 4 tons of tankering fuel on board in this particular situation, we might opt to not load them in first place and then reach our landing, or then match our landing weight to below the maximum landing weight. So these are the 2 calculations that we run before departure. From here on, we need to go further to the landing en route calculation, and this is what we do in flight. So the previous 2 are what you do prior to takeoff, that's why it says landing dispatch, and now we're on the landing en route page, and this is what we do before each landing, typically during the approach preparations while we're still in cruise flight. You can see our destination airport, Southend, has already been pre-filled since we imported our SimReef plan. We are going to go for runway 23 over there, and then we can continue down here with the aircraft data. If you hit the import aircraft details button, it is going to import your present weight, not your forecast landing weight. The reason for that is that just exactly as per the real Boeing 737, the performance tool is not able to read anything directly from the airplane. It is a tablet that is basically disconnected from the airplane, and it's exactly the same in the real Boeing 737. Now, therefore, you need to adjust your weight in order to match the weight that you predict. So, let's say, for example, we estimate 65 tons of landing weight. Okay, submit that. Now we go for import weather. Again, in terms of the wind, the same applies that I mentioned earlier. So let's hit calculate now, and let's have a look into the results we are getting. You can see right now that we've got a landing distance required of 1,927, landing distance available 1,904. Be aware that in the version 1.0 of the release, this is going to be fixed with the later versions, I'm very sure about that. The available landing distance down here still takes the full runway length as you have it in your simulator. It ignores any displaced threshold, so you have to keep that in mind. For our landing right now, we've got 1,741 meters available and not 1,904 as indicated over here. That is going to be fixed in a future version, but I want you to be aware of this ahead of time so that you don't overrun any runways on your landings. Alright, so a couple of things that we can do. Our default settings here are landing flap 30, PAX on, anti-ice off, VREF addition 5 knots. And of course no non-normal conditions. But if you had any failures, you could choose them down here and the system would calculate accordingly for you. Today we luckily don't have any. So continuing then, we've got an auto brake 3 setting pre-selected by default. The reason for that is auto brake 3 is what is actually used the most in the Boeing 737, but you can try others as well. If you go for maximum auto brake, for example, and now hit calculate again, you will see that all of a sudden we just need 1,342 meters of landing runway, and it is going to show you whereabout on the runway you're eventually going to stop. So in this case you can see we can actually land the airplane. Now, maximum auto brake is going to be very violent and you will have a long time to cool your brakes. So if we go ahead and go back to auto brakes 3 and hit that calculation again, we basically need to get rid of like 200 meters of landing run in order to be able to land our airplane. Now, there's a few things we can try. First of all, we can choose flaps 40. Let's see how big the difference is going to be. Now we've got 1,927 and now we've got 1,788. Now, again, those 1,788 are a little bit too long, as you can see down here. That bar showing you where you stop is still beyond the runway end. Do note that this bar is shown correctly on the landing distance available, and it ignores any displaced, or it takes into account the displaced threshold. It ignores the incorrect data we are seeing over here. So 1,788 is what we can do over here with flaps 40 compared to flaps 30, so that is somewhat a little bit better already, but we still need to do a bit more. Now, we still got reverser config, no credit. If we went to reversers all operational and hit calculate on that one, you actually see there's no change. And the reason for that is reversers are not taken into account for the calculation on a dry runway. If the runway was wet, then the reversers are taken into account, and if you calculate that, you can see the distance has moved a little bit. So on a wet runway, reversers count. On a dry runway, they are not taken into account as per legal regulations. So as you can see, with this data, we cannot land the airplane with auto brakes 3. That means we have to increase to maximum auto brakes for this landing and calculate that 1,250 meters. Perfect, we can do that. So, the important thing for you to take into account now is maximum auto brake is going to provide a lot of heating for the brakes. Technically speaking, you could go back to a flaps 30 landing. If we hit calculate with that, we can see we're still able to land the plane. However, that higher speed that we'll have on the approach using landing flaps 30 compared to landing flaps 40, which usually is 8 knots of difference, that is going to provide additional heating of the brakes, so think about that as well when you're choosing the landing flap setting. Alright, so by default this would be our calculation, and this would be what I would base this performance on. However, do take into account that while the reversers are not taken into account for the stopping distance on a dry runway, they are taken into account for your brake cooling time. Now, brake cooling time is something that I'm personally hoping to be added in a future version, but do note that by default it is not included in the real-life Boeing OPT either. It is available as an expansion package that airlines can purchase. Now, my airline only purchased it like a couple months before I left my old airline, and prior to that we didn't have that either, so in these terms the PMDG UFT is accurate to the real tool. Alright, that's basically it for how to use your performance calculator and what kind of things you need to take into consideration when you are doing your mathematics on it. I would like to say thank you very much for watching now, hope that you have learned something on this. Do let me know in the comments below how you are using it and how you are liking it, and then I'm looking forward to see you again on the next video. Thank you very much, and as always, hit that like button if you did like the video, as it does help with YouTube algorithms, and don't forget to subscribe for more content coming in the future. Thank you very much for watching. If you really like what I'm doing, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. But until then, I'd like to wish you a very nice time flying with a PMDG Universal to Flight tablet. And I'd like to finish with saying that I'm just looking forward to the future updates as much as you guys do as well. Thank you for watching, and see you all again on the next one.